Well, it's wonderful to be here with you this morning. That's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, my wife Anne was able to join me and be down here with me this morning, which is great. I've also been joined by my PA, Rio, who's also come down to do two things, really. One is just in case any of you have any questions that you think we may be able to answer, you can speak with her and we'll do our very best to get back to you. But more importantly, I've done a little bit of travel in the last 2 weeks. So 2 weekends ago, I was in Singapore for 3 days where I was speaking there. I finished on Monday afternoon. I got on a plane and flew to New York. I arrived Tuesday night. I spoke in Manhattan Wednesday and Thursday. On Friday, I got on a plane and I flew nonstop to Hong Kong, arriving Saturday afternoon. I spoke Saturday night, Sunday morning, Sunday evening. And then Monday morning, I got on a plane and flew to Taipei to be there just in time for the typhoon. And I was there for 2 days and then was able to get my ticket then rerouted back via Singapore so I could pick up a plane to get back here to arrive here about 24 hours ago. So the other reason why Rio is here is just in case what I say doesn't make any sense whatsoever. We will try and find a similar message I've said somewhere else and we'll send that to you to be able to follow. So that's the other reason why I'm actually happy to be here is I actually woke up this morning in time to be down here with you. So either way, I hope that what I share will make a little bit of sense, and it is indeed a great privilege. And if you are, as a visitor here, or you're watching this in one of the other sites, no matter where you are, no matter what physical distances may separate us as we all come together this morning, the simple truth is that Alpha has changed millions of lives right across the world. And if you're sitting here and you're as an atheist, you come as a skeptic, you were told to come along this morning by a friend because they promised you it might be interesting, and you're already planning retribution for being misled. I'd just like to start by saying, and this may be the most important thing I might say all morning, but if you are an atheist, you're more or less morally obliged to do Alpha. Let me explain why I come to that conclusion. This church, along with many others who run these kinds of programs, believe in taking the gospel of Jesus Christ into their communities and across the world. In other words, they like to share who Jesus is and they like to see people become Christians. As an atheist, you believe that's a very bad idea and something that should be prevented. By coming along on Alpha, you will be consuming some of the resources and money they spend on you, which means they'll have less money to spend overseas to convert people over there. So it's about time you took a hit for the team and put yourself in the firing line to protect others. Come along to Alpha. You may be surprised both by the people you meet and also by what you learn. But what I would like to talk with you this morning is a subject matter that I've been asked to speak on in the last 1.5 years or so right across the world. In the last 18 months, I've had the privilege of speaking to government leaders, sometimes in public sessions, sometimes in closed sessions, both east and west, and also in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And every single government group I've gone to speak to in the last 1.5 years, including some that I'll be speaking to before this year is out, have all asked me to speak to the same theme and answer the same question. At the same time, I have also been invited to speak to sort of leading business groups, both east and west, and also in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, and they too have also asked me to address exactly the same question. So when you receive invitations to speak east, west, north, south, and every group is asking you to address the same issue, it causes you to hold back and pause and say, what is it that's driving this same question, this same concern, regardless of geography, regardless of culture, regardless of background? What is it? Why is there something happening which is causing so many people to ask the same issue? And what I'm going to try and do this morning is I'm going to deal with it from one angle. In one of the later services, I'm going to come at the same issue from a different angle. You don't have to do both, don't worry. One day in church is enough. Unless, of course, you happen to be the preacher, in which case you have to go to all of them. I'm saying that to gain sympathy. But what is it? What is it that's driving this question? Because the issue which I've been asked to speak on repeatedly around the world is the issue of reconciliation. How is it possible to bring a divided society, a divided group of people back together again? How is that possible? Now, what is driving this question? Well, I think there are a variety of factors. I don't have time to unpack all of them for you. If any of you have read or come across a well-known book that became very public a short while ago called Capital by a French writer called Thomas Piketty, you'll be aware that in this book he talks about the fact that the rate of return on capital has far outstripped the rate of return on income. What does that mean? What that means is in the last couple of decades, the valuation of things like houses and other big capital things that you can buy has grown at a way faster rate than people's incomes have risen. Which basically means, if you're listening to this and you would consider yourself working class, middle class, or upper middle class, one of the primary problems you think you face as you look to the future, and one of the primary unanswered questions you will have, is how on earth will my children ever be able to afford to buy their own home? Even if they were to get an incredibly well-paying job. So I live in Oxford. My hometown is Oxford. Even if my children were to get the highest paid consultancy role at the research hospital attached to Oxford University, even if they reached the very top, they would struggle within Oxford to buy a fairly modestly sized home. So there is a growing sense across this world in almost every major metropolis of people feeling economically excluded with no hope of ever being able to buy in. And that sense of exclusion, in the absence of hope, begins to create an intense sense of distrust and indeed failure of justice. Now, at the same time, we're also wrestling personally with all kinds of things we don't properly understand. Because for decades we've been told we can do whatever we want, go wherever we want, and just sleep around, do whatever we want. It makes no difference. But we're slowly realizing it does make a difference. I don't know if any of you have read any books by a guy called Ramsden, who's a well-known author. He tends to publish about every 3, 4, 5 years. His latest book is called Purity. And fairly on at the beginning of that book, if you've bought it or read it, you may remember that the heroine, or the central character rather, of that book, this lady called Elizabeth, who goes by the name Purity, she's sitting in a cafe having a cup of coffee. And as she's having a cup of coffee, she sees a guy that she likes, and they start up a conversation. And very quickly, she starts off asking herself the following question. She says, "Dare I risk the intimacy of a friendship, or shall I retreat into the relative safety of casual sex?" That's the question she has. Dare I risk the intimacy of friendship, where I can get hurt, betrayed? Or shall I just reduce this down into the physical, where there's actually, I hope, no risk of getting hurt? And this is a question and scenario that plays out in real life. And when Franzen puts that question into the heart of this young 20-or-something-year-old character, he is absolutely where so many people in this culture currently feel. Where do we actually make connection? Is there a place in which we can actually be understood and where it is safe? Or is it just too risky even to go there? So we have an even sense of internal alienation and separation from those around us. And then, of course, we raise this on a huge scale politically. There isn't a single country I've spoken to in the last world, in the last year, world. We're going to leave that alien stuff until the next sermon. That's something else. There isn't a single country that I have spoken in the last year in which the question of whether that nation should remain together or split up is not being raised. And within the UK, I'm not thinking, by the way, just of the recent referendum on Scotland. There are 6 independence movements within the UK. If all of them go their own way, we will be 6 different nations. There's another well-known writer, Japanese writer by the name of Ishiguro. If you haven't read him, you may have seen the film Remains of the Day with someone famous in it. Is it Anthony Hopkins? As usual, the book is so much better. But his latest book got panned by many critics. They didn't like it. But I actually think that Ishiguro's latest novel is perhaps one of the most interesting commentaries on this political dissolving that we're seeing happening in this world. It's entitled The Buried Giant. And in that book, he imagines early Christian Britain. And everyone is living in a state of forgetfulness. People literally cannot remember the past. There's this elderly couple, and they know they're married to each other, but they can't remember when they were married, how long they've been married. They're struggling even to remember if they've had children. They think they have, but they can't be sure. So they set off on a quest to recover their memory. And as they travel through early Christian Britain, they pick up various traveling companions along the way. And this highly unlikely group of people eventually find the source of their forgetfulness. And so now they're looking at the source of what is causing all of them to forget. And the question they're asking themselves is, should we do something to allow all of us to recover our memory or not? And there is a warrior who is part of this party. And as they're debating, the warrior looks at them and says, if we end this state of forgetfulness, quick-tongued men will make ancient grievances rhyme with current desire for land and conquest, and the result will be war and mayhem, or war and revenge. Did you hear what he said? If we recover our memory, and we remember our historical grievances and the historical things which divided us, people will come along today and make those ancient grievances rhyme with our current desire in order to have more, and revenge will destroy us all. And in that sense, Ishiguro in his novel is capturing a mood which seems to be spread right across this world as nation splits into nations and as people turn against people. Which is why business leaders, political leaders around the world are asking the question, is it possible for us to be reconciled? Is it possible for a group of people at war with themselves to come back to and with each other? Now, there is more to this story, and as I said, that's going to have to wait for another time. But let me share with you just one biblical passage which I think has something to say into all of this. Because what we're actually talking about when we raise this question is our search for peace. An internal, external, and eternal search for peace. We search for peace internally within ourselves. My boss, Ravi Zacharias, wrote a children's story in which he tells the story of a boy and a girl. The boy has collected a large collection of marbles, and the girl has collected a large collection of hard-boiled sweets, and they keep both of their collections in these glass jars. And they've had them for a while, and they come together, and they're talking, and they decide it would be fun to change collections. He will hand over his jar of marbles, she will hand over her jar of sweets. So they agree the next day to meet together just before school. But the boy, as he's walking the next morning to the meeting point, is looking at his jar, and he realizes that there are 2 or 3 marbles he likes more than any other. And so he puts his hand in and he fishes them out and he hides them in his pocket. And now they come together. And the girl holds up her boiled sweets. And she says, are those all of your marbles? He says, yes. She says, well, these are all of my sweets. And she hands his over her jar, and he hands over his. And they both go their separate way. That night, she is sleeping soundly in bed. But the boy can't get to sleep. He's asking the same question over and over and over again. I wonder if she gave me all of her sweets. You see, the loss of internal peace that we suffer doesn't simply come about because of things that people do to us. It also comes about by the things that we do to ourselves. We have this loss of internal peace, and we're looking for an inner form of reconciliation. We're looking for external reconciliation with others where we feel let down or hurt or offended. One of my colleagues, who I used to work with, an Indian guy who used to read 18 different languages but could only speak 14 of them fluently, which to me just smacked of intellectual laziness, because what's the point of learning to read all those languages if you can't speak all of them? He was once in Asia speaking to a group of leaders, and he asked all of the leaders to close their eyes and imagine a sign of peace, a picture of peace. What did peace look like? And they all came up with different pictures: snow-capped mountains, still lakes, fields filled with flowers. But all of these pictures had one thing in common. There were no people in them. Isn't that interesting? When asked to imagine what peace looks like, the first thing we do is eliminate everyone else. This actually is the single greatest HR problem that exists in modern day employment. And we ask about our search for peace eternally. Is it possible even to find peace with God? Can that happen? Is it possible? I don't know if any of you have seen that great philosophical commentary on the 20th century entitled The Simpsons. But there's a scene in one of those cartoons where Homer Simpson is walking with God. And he says, God, what's all of this about and why am I here? And God says to him, Homer, I can't tell you that until you die. And Homer says, he says, I can't wait that long. And God says, you can't wait for 6 months? Is that when we find what it's all about, when we rest in peace, quite literally? How is it possible? Now, interestingly, Jesus told a story that answers this whole thing about trying to find peace and getting right with ourselves and getting right with God. But his answer is really quite shocking. because he says that the answer is not found within us. As a matter of fact, the problems are found within us. As a matter of fact, if we trust in our own ability to make all of this right and to get right with ourselves and right with others and right before God, we're in trouble. And he told this story in Luke chapter 18, where he says, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, he told the following parable. And Jesus now tells a well-known story that some of you may know. For others, it will be brand new. Jesus is telling a story about people who want to be right. They want to be right with themselves. Now, the trouble is, in English, when we talk about self-righteousness, we equate that with arrogance. But that's technically too narrow. You can be self-righteous and try and be very humble about it. Or you can be self-righteous and very arrogant about it. Or you can believe that actually it's not possible to make yourself right. You need some other kind of righteousness. You need someone else to make you right. And you can be very humble about it. And you can believe that you need someone else to come and make you right and put things right. And you can be very humble about it. You need to just separate those two out. But to those who are confident in themselves and in their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told a parable. He said 2 people went to the temple to pray. Now, in the time of Jesus, when you talked about going to the temple to pray, that meant one of 2 things. 1, that you were going into an empty building, you were going to sit and pray. Or 2, you were going to a service like this one, with a lot of people here. This probably is the second. Now, how do we know that? Well, it says 2 men went to the temple to pray. They went at the same time. One was a Pharisee, one was a tax collector. They're 2 very different people. And it says, but they stand by themselves and pray. Now, what's going on? Now, the Pharisee, we said, stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. So the Pharisee, this religious person, goes into the church to pray and he boasts about how good he is. However, that's not what happens with the second guy. The Pharisee says, I fast twice a week, I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector, who understood he was doing something wrong, stood at a distance. He wouldn't even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, that word, when the tax collector prays, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Some of you, if you've been to a more traditional service or more traditional church, may be familiar with the words Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. Any of you know what those words mean? Just put up your hand, the cultured ones of you. Okay, that's 5. Okay, and the rest of you, we need to restore classical education to this country. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison are 2 Greek words. They literally mean Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. And they're found in the Bible, and indeed in some forms of church service, we say it, or we may even sing it to each other. But when the tax collector stands a long way off and will not even look up to heaven, he doesn't say, Lord, have mercy to me. He doesn't say, Kyrie eleison. That's not what he prays. He actually prays something which is very different. What he actually says is, hilastatoi moi. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm going to explain that. Because what he prays, what the tax collector prays, is, Lord, may there be a propitiation to me. May you be propitious to me. Now, that's not a word we use anymore, so let me explain what that means. Every day in the temple, at sunrise and sunset, a lamb was sacrificed for the forgiveness of sins. After the priest had sacrificed a lamb for the forgiveness of sins, the priest would turn around and he would walk off, imagine this platform, through the back, through a curtain. He would light incense and he would pray on behalf of the nation. At this point, you, the congregation, are just looking at a blank platform. So at this point, everybody offered up their own prayers. Okay, you'll see this elsewhere in the Gospel of Luke, in Luke chapter 1, when it says, when it was Zachariah's turn to burn incense before the people, all the people stood outside praying. Well, of course, that's what they do. That's why we read it in chapter 1. There's nothing else for them to do. This is when you offer up your own prayers. So these two men go to the temple at the same time. After the sacrifice has been made, they both pray. The Pharisee stands by himself and says, look at me, God, I'm doing fantastically well and I've got everything sorted. I am literally self-righteous. The other one stands there and says, there is no hope for me. I am not a good person. Please forgive me. And as he prays, he literally says, may that sacrifice for sin, may it be for me. May the price, God, that you are paying for what I have done wrong, may it be for me. All forgiveness comes at a price. If I were to come and borrow your car, let's suppose you have a Mercedes 1953 Gullwing SLS, and if you happen to own that car, please come and introduce yourself at the end. I would love to come and visit you. And you lend me your car. And I come back a couple of hours later and I drop off the keys and I say, you know that beautiful Mercedes SLS? Well, it's now a skateboard. And you come out and sure enough, it's still got 4 wheels, but it's about this high. And you look at me and you say, Michael, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. Now that's amazing. I did something wrong and I just ruined your car. And you just forgave me. I don't pay anything. But that doesn't mean that no one pays. You pay. You pay for what I did. We talk about forgiveness as if it's the easiest thing in the world, but there's normally a cost with it. And every morning and every evening in the temple, a lamb was offered for the sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. God saying, I'm prepared to pay for what you have done wrong. And this man who knows he's done lots of things wrong, when he prays, he says, Lord, may that sacrifice for sin, that forgiveness for sin, may that be for me. And Jesus says, I tell you, that man went home having been justified, went home having been made right with God, not the other. For whoever who exalt themselves will be humbled, and whoever humbles themselves will be exalted. The incredible thing and the incredible hope of the Christian gospel is that sense of inner peace that we have lost, the wrong things we've done against ourselves. That sense of external peace we have lost, broken relationship with others, where we wonder how it's possible to forgive them for what they have done. And that sense of eternal loss, is it possible to truly find peace with God? God himself has done something about. God has actually stepped into this world. And just as you heard so beautifully this morning, makes it possible to find peace within, peace with others, and also peace with God because of what he has done and the provision he has made.
I'm Bear Grylls. My favourite way to start the day, the Bible in 1 year. That's how wild I am.
Find out more at BibleIn1year.org or download the Bible in 1 Year app.